The gallows were 75 feet tall, not 10 feet, not 20, 75. That is the height of a 7-story building, and Haman built it himself, in his own yard, specifically to hang one man on it. One man who would not bow, not a rival king, not a military general, not someone who had stolen his position or threatened his family, a man sitting at a gate, a man who simply refused to lower himself when Haman walked past. That single act of noncompliance drove the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire to construct a public execution monument visible from across the city. And if you think that is a story about ancient politics, if you think Haman is some extreme outlier with nothing to do with your life, I want to ask you to stay here for the next 15 minutes. Because Haman is not a monster. Haman is a mirror, and what he reflects is more familiar than most of us are comfortable admitting. Esther, chapter 3, introduces Haman in a single sentence before the conflict begins. King Xerxes elevated him above all the other nobles. Immediately after him, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid him honor. The king had commanded it, but Mordecai would not kneel. Everything you need to understand about Haman lives in that gap, between the entire empire bowing and one man standing straight. The ancient myth of Narcissus gives us the psychological frame. Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection in a pool of water. He could not eat, could not sleep. He wasted away staring at the one image that confirmed he was what he believed himself to be. Most people read that as vanity. But vanity is not quite the diagnosis. Narcissus is a story about identity. The reflection was not just beautiful to him, the reflection was him. Without it, he did not know who he was. Haman's identity is structured exactly the same way. His sense of self is not internal. It is not built on private conviction or personal integrity. It is assembled entirely from external signals, titles, ranks, the visible submission of people around him. Every bow is not a courtesy. Every bow is a brick in the wall of who Haman believes himself to be. Which is why Mordecai's refusal is not experienced as a social slight. It is experienced as a structural threat. If one person does not bow, the reflection is cracked. And a cracked reflection begins to raise the one question Haman cannot survive asking. What if I'm not what I think I am? Esther, sure, 3:5-6. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel, he was enraged. But then, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. He looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people throughout the entire empire. One man did not bow. Haman's response was genocide. This is the psychology of fragile identity under existential threat. The disproportionate response is not irrational inside Haman's framework. It is logical. Because if the problem were simply Mordecai, you could remove Mordecai. But Mordecai's existence proves the deference Haman requires is not universal. And if it is not universal, it was never really proof of anything. To silence that proof permanently, you must remove not just the man, but the possibility that anyone like him can exist. A fragile ego does not experience another person's personal choice as a personal choice. It experiences it as a verdict, and it will go to extraordinary lengths to overturn that verdict. Haman is not stupid. He is administratively capable, politically connected, and fluent enough socially to have risen to the highest office in Persia beneath the king himself. His problem is not intelligence. His problem is obsession. And obsession does something to the mind that intelligence cannot correct. It builds a filter through which only confirming information passes. Esther 5:9-13 is the clearest window into this distortion. Haman had just come from Esther's private banquet. The queen had personally invited him. He had sat at a table with the king and queen of Persia. He was at the peak of his influence by any objective measure. Then he walked past the gate, and Mordecai did not stand. He went home, called his wife and friends, and then he listed his achievement, his wealth, his sons, the ways the king had honored him, his elevation above every other official. He rehearsed his resume to his own family, people who already knew everything on the list. Then, verse 13. And yet all of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. All of it. The wealth, the sons, the queen's dinner table. None of it registers as long as one man at a gate refuses to stand. This is what pride does. not remove good things from your life, but remove your ability to experience them. Haman has more than almost any human alive in that moment. But a self built on external validation cannot rest in what it has. It can only track what it lacks. And what it lacks is never really a bow. What it lacks is the internal foundation that would allow a person to absorb a slight without being dismantled by it. His wife Zeresh and his friends do not offer him counsel. They offer escalation. Build a pole 50 cubits high. Have Mordecai hanged on it in the morning. 50 cubits, 75 feet. You can execute a man at 8 feet. The 75-foot structure is not a solution. It is a monument, a public statement that the man who refused to acknowledge Haman's importance will die in a way the entire city can witness. And nobody in the room says, Haman, this is too much. Nobody names what is actually happening. They say, build it, because the echo chamber only moves in one direction, louder, faster, with no friction to slow the descent. A person surrounded entirely by amplifiers has no warning system. And without a warning system, the first sign of the fall is the ground rushing up. If this is already landing somewhere real, drop a comment below. Tell me, what is your Mordecai? What is the thing that should have no power over your peace but somehow does? And if this kind of depth is what you have been looking for, subscribe. We open scripture like this every single week. I want to stay with the Gallows because most readings move past it too quickly. The Hebrew word is etz, wood, pole, tree. This is not a hidden structure. It is a public installation built in Haman's own property. 50 cubits, visible to the neighborhood, to the city, to the court. You do not build a 75-foot execution structure for functional reasons. You build it for theatrical ones. Haman is not solving a problem. He is making a statement. But here's the psychological principle underneath the timber. The traps we design for others are always built in the language of our own wounds. Haman's deepest wound is being seen as ordinary, dismissible, someone whose presence commands no response. So the punishment he designs is maximum public visibility. A 75-foot declaration that Mordecai's non-compliance will be answered with a spectacle no one in the city can ignore. He is not punishing Mordecai. He is projecting onto Mordecai the one thing he himself cannot bear: erasure, insignificance, being placed where no one will miss you or mourn you or lower their eyes. The trap is autobiographical. It always is. The person who responds to being overlooked by making others invisible. The person who punishes coldness with coldness. The person who designs their revenge in the exact shape of the wound they are carrying. They are not confronting their enemy. They are describing themselves. And Esther 7:10 records the ending with a brevity that is almost brutal. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. The monument to his ego became his tomb. Esther chapter 6 begins with the smallest possible detail. The king could not sleep. Not a crisis, not a political emergency. The king could not sleep. He had his chronicles read aloud. The page that was read described the day Mordecai had uncovered and reported an assassination plot, and had never been rewarded for it. At that exact moment, as the attendants finished speaking, Haman arrived in the outer court. He had come early, before anyone else, to request permission to hang Mordecai on the structure he had built the night before. The king called him in and asked, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman thought to himself, "Who would the king honor more than me?" So he described a royal procession. The king's own robes, the king's own horse, a noble, proclaiming through the city square, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." The king said, "Go immediately. Do exactly as you have suggested. Do this for Mordecai." Haman led Mordecai through the city, calling out the proclamation himself, for the man he had come to hang before breakfast. The principle in Proverbs 16:18 is not a warning, it is a description. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Not sometimes, not in extreme cases, before. Pride is the mechanism that produces the fall because it systematically eliminates the information needed to prevent it. Haman could not read the political climate clearly because he had filtered everything through his own agenda. He could not read the king's loyalty because he was too consumed by his own intentions. He walked into the palace that morning, so certain of the outcome that he mentally filled in the blank before the question was finished. And when the king asked, "For whom should honor be done?" Haman answered without hesitation. Of course it was him. The fall was never a surprise from outside. It was the destination of a road Haman had been paving for years. Blind spot by blind spot, boast by boast, echo chamber by echo chamber, until the road he believed led to supremacy delivered him to the gallows he built with his own hands. I want to bring this home honestly, because a character study like this can drift into comfortable distance. We examine Haman, shake our heads, and walk away feeling like we have learned something about someone else. I want to challenge that exit. The story of Haman does not ask, "Could you build a 75-foot gallows?" It asks, "What are you already building?" 3 questions. I want you to sit with each one honestly. First, where in your life are you tracking what one person withholds more than what many others offer? When the single absence outweighs the plural presence, when the one person who did not acknowledge you matters more than the 10 who did, that ratio is a diagnostic. Something is rooted there that is deeper than the situation. Second, who are the people around you who have never told you something you did not want to hear? Not enemies. The people you call your inner circle. If that list contains no friction, no challenge, no uncomfortable truth ever delivered with love, you do not have counsel. You have amplifiers. And amplifiers are not safe. They are the people who tell you to build the gallows and ask no questions about the height. Third, what have you built? Or what are you in the process of building that is too large for the wound that started it? The 75-foot structure was not built for Mordecai. It was built for the wound. And the wound was never going to be healed by what happened to Mordecai. It was only going to be dramatized by it. Here's the final truth this story will not let us avoid. Haman's ruin was not imposed on him from the outside. It grew from the inside, from a self so dependent on external confirmation that the withdrawal of one man's bow could set the entire structure in motion toward collapse. The higher the position built on that foundation, the more catastrophic the fall. The alternative is not humility performed for an audience. That is just pride wearing a different costume. The alternative is the slow, honest, private work of asking, why does this particular thing have this particular power over me? And sitting with that answer long enough to do something about it before the wood is already in your yard. Because the gallows is always built before the verdict. The question is whether you recognize what you are constructing before it is finished. If one of those 3 questions landed somewhere uncomfortable, name it in the comments. You do not need to explain everything, just name something. That is where the dismantling starts. And if this study gave you something real, share it with someone who is quietly building something too large for the wound behind it. They may not know what they are doing yet. Subscribe so you never miss a study like this, and we will see you in the next one.